There's a photograph that most people have never seen. It was taken in 1935 inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in the prison's small recreation room. Four men sit together, convicted killers, bank robbers, and the most notorious gangster in American history. They are holding instruments, a guitar, a harmonica, a pair of homemade percussion pieces fashioned from tin cups, and a banjo. The man holding the banjo is Al Capone, prisoner number 85. Former public enemy number 1, the man who had controlled Chicago, who had made millions, who had ordered executions and run an empire that stretched across the Midwest. He is smiling, not the careful, calculated smile from his newspaper photographs. Something smaller, something real. The smile of a man who has found, inside the worst place he has ever been, the one thing that still makes him feel like himself. This is the story of that banjo, and what it meant, and what it cost. Very few people know that Al Capone loved music, not as background noise, not as atmosphere for his famous parties, but genuinely, deeply, personally. He had been surrounded by music his whole life. His mother Teresa sang Italian folk songs while cooking, filling their crowded Brooklyn apartment with melodies that Capone would remember for the rest of his life. His father Gabriel played the mandolin on Sunday evenings. The whole family gathered around, the outside world and its difficulties temporarily forgotten. Music was the language of the Capone household, the thread that held them together through poverty and displacement and the difficulties of immigrant life in early 20th century Brooklyn. As a young man, Capone had taught himself to play the banjo, not professionally, not with any formal training, but with the same intensity he brought to everything, obsessive, driven, refusing to stop until he'd mastered it. He practiced late at night, after the Harvard Inn closed and the streets grew quiet, sitting in his small room and working through chords until his fingers ached. When he moved to Chicago and built his empire, the banjo came with him. There's a story told by people who worked for him, people who knew him before he became a legend, that Capone would sometimes disappear from strategy meetings, and his men would find him in a back room playing the banjo alone, just playing for no audience, for no purpose other than the music itself. Me knew about the banjo. He played when he was stressed, she told a friend years later, when things got bad, when the pressure was too much. He'd pick it up and just disappear into it, like it was the only place where he was just Al, not Scarface, not the boss, not any of it, just a man playing a tune. When they arrested him in 1931 and the empire began to crumble, Capone packed the banjo last. His lawyers packed the legal documents. His accountants packed the financial records. Me packed their personal belongings. And at the very end, Capone wrapped the banjo carefully in a cloth and carried it out himself, the last thing to leave the Lexington Hotel. The federal prison in Atlanta let him keep it. Atlanta had privileges, as did Capone, whose money had purchased a degree of comfort even behind bars. He played in his cell at night, and other prisoners would stop to listen through the walls. Even guards would pause in the corridor, arrested by something unexpected. Sound of real music coming from the cell of the country's most famous criminal. But Atlanta ended in August 1934 when they transferred him to Alcatraz. And Alcatraz had different rules. The day Capone arrived at the Rock, the intake officers cataloged everything he'd brought: clothes, personal items, a Bible, and the banjo. The guard who processed him held the banjo for a moment, examining it like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "This stays with processing," the guard said. "We'll review whether it's permitted." Capone felt something cold move through him. "That's my banjo. I've had it for 15 years. Prisoner 85, the guard said without looking up. "Everything gets reviewed. You'll be notified of the decision." He walked away with it, just like that, and Capone, who had faced gang wars and federal investigations, and prison without flinching, felt something frighteningly close to panic. He spent his first 3 weeks at Alcatraz without the banjo, not knowing if he'd ever get it back. Those who knew him from before would have recognized the change, the restlessness, the inability to focus, the brittle edge to everything he said and did. He'd lost his empire, his freedom, his reputation. But this, the banjo, the music, the one private place that was entirely his own, felt like the final loss. Then in September 1934, Warden James Johnston made an unexpected decision. Johnston was known as Saltwater Jimmy, a tough administrator who ran Alcatraz with iron discipline. He was not sentimental, not soft, and he had no particular sympathy for Al Capone. But he understood something about prison management that others missed. Music was a safety valve. Prisoners who had outlets for expression, were less volatile, less dangerous, less likely to explode into the kind of violence that made wardens' lives difficult. He returned the banjo to Capone, not as a favor, not as a kindness, as a calculated management decision. But whatever the reason, when the guard appeared at Capone's cell and held out the instrument, Capone reached for it with hands that weren't quite steady. "Thank you," he said quietly. The guard shrugged. "Don't thank me." Thank the warden. Capone sat on his cot that night and played until the lights went out, and in the cells around him, hardened criminals lay on their bunks and listened to the music coming through the walls and felt, just for a moment, something that resembled peace. The Rock Islanders formed in late 1935. Capone had been talking to other prisoners during yard time. The way you do when you're trying to maintain your sanity inside four walls. He discovered, in the way that musicians always discover each other, that there were others like him, men who'd played instruments on the outside, who carried music inside them the way he did, who ached for the outlet of organized sound. There was Tex Lucas, doing life for bank robbery, who could play guitar with a delicacy that seemed impossible from hands that size. In his life before prison, Lucas had played at dances in small Texas towns, had dreamed once of making a real living from music. The dream had ended when poverty led him to crime, but the music never left. There was a counterfeiter named Armstrong who had perfect pitch and could harmonize with anything, his voice finding the spaces between notes with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural given that he'd never had a single lesson. There was a young safe cracker whose name nobody quite remembered, but who had a voice, clear and pure and completely out of place in Alcatraz, that could make hardened men uncomfortable in their chests without warning. Capone organized them. Of course he did. Organization was what he knew, what his mind reached for automatically, what gave him purpose in a place designed to strip purpose away. He arranged the weekly rehearsals, secured the practice space through careful negotiations with sympathetic guards, negotiations that were more sophisticated than any business deal he'd conducted on the outside, involving favors and information and the careful management of personalities. He created a set list that balanced the familiar with the challenging, assigned parts that played to each man's strengths, created a structure that turned four prisoners with instruments into something that actually sounded like a band. The same skills that had built the Chicago outfit now built a prison band. Different materials, different stakes, but the same mind, the same instinct for how men work together and what they need to function as a unit. They called themselves the Rock Islanders, half joke, half pride, a name that acknowledged where they were, the Rock, Alcatraz, the island prison, without letting where they were define them entirely. They weren't just prisoners, they were musicians. They were the Rock Islanders. Warden Johnston approved the band as part of the prison's rehabilitation program, a decision that surprised even Johnston himself when he thought about it later. He was allowing Al Capone to run an organization inside his prison, but he'd seen what happened when men had no outlets, and the music seemed, against all logic, to be doing something real. They would play Sunday afternoon concerts in the recreation room for other inmates, for the occasional visiting official, for the guards who chose to attend. Not a stage, not an audience in the traditional sense, just a group of men who found, in the making of music together, something that the walls and the bars and the sentence couldn't take away. The rehearsals became the structure around which Capone organized his week. Monday through Saturday, he endured prison, the tedium, the violence, the slow progression of the disease he still refused to fully acknowledge. But Sunday rehearsal was different. Sunday rehearsal was something to look forward to, something that gave the intervening days purpose. He pushed the band hard, perfectionist, impatient with sloppiness, demanding of himself and everyone around him. Again, he'd say when a passage went wrong, "From the top, cleaner this time." Tex Lucas would roll his eyes, Armstrong would sigh, but they'd play it again and then again because Capone's standards were impossible to ignore, and because on some level they understood that his insistence on quality was what made the music worth playing. Guard Robert Baker, who monitored the Sunday sessions, kept a personal journal during his years at Alcatraz. His entries from 1935 and 1936 returned repeatedly to the Rock Islanders. Sunday session again, Baker wrote in October 1935, Capone on banjo, Lucas on guitar, Armstrong harmonizing. They played You Are My Sunshine, and then something I didn't recognize, something Capone had apparently arranged himself. The other men in the room went quiet when they played. Never seen that happen here. Alcatraz doesn't go quiet. Another entry from March 1936. Hard to reconcile what I know about Capone with what I see on Sundays. The man who reportedly ordered the Valentine's Day killings. The man who ran Chicago like a feudal lord. And then there's this other thing, the way he plays, the way he listens to the other men play. Like it matters to him more than anything else in here, maybe more than anything else at all. But something was changing, slowly at first, easy to miss, easy to attribute to off days and poor sleep and the general grinding misery of Alcatraz. Capone would lose his place in a song and have to be redirected, would forget arrangements he'd known for months, would show up to rehearsal looking confused about what they were working on. The other Rock Islanders noticed, but said, "Nothing in Alcatraz. You didn't talk about a man's weaknesses unless you wanted to be his enemy." And besides, the moments of confusion passed. Capone would find his place again, his fingers settling back into familiar patterns, and the music would continue. But by 1937, the moments were lasting longer. And by 1938, they weren't just moments anymore. Neurosyphilis that had lived in Capone's body since he was a teenager was reaching his brain now, eating away at the neural pathways that stored memory and coordination and the ability to process complex information. The prison doctors had been tracking its progression for years. They knew what was coming. In some ways, the Rock Islanders had been watching it too. In the small ways, the music was changing. Tex Lucas told the story later to a journalist who was documenting the Alcatraz years. There was a rehearsal in late 1937, Lucas said, where Capone stopped in the middle of a song and just looked at his hands, like he didn't know what they were supposed to be doing, like he'd forgotten what the banjo was for, and then something clicked and he started playing again, but we all saw it, we all knew what it meant. Guard Baker's journal entry from January 1938 was brief and sad. Capone forgot the words to Mac the Knife today. He's played it 50 times, he sang the wrong verse twice. When we finished, he sat there for a long time just holding the banjo against his chest. He didn't say anything, neither did anyone else. What was there to say? The last Rock Islanders concert that Al Capone fully participated in happened on a Sunday evening in March 1938. They played in the recreation room as they always did, a dozen prisoners and a handful of guards as their audience. The program was the usual mix: popular songs, some jazz standards, a few Italian folk melodies that Capone had arranged himself in the early months. Baker was there, journal in his pocket. He described it afterward. Something was different tonight. Capone was present, more present than he'd been in weeks, focused, his eyes clear. He played the opening numbers cleanly, the way he used to play them 18 months ago. And then near the end, without saying anything to the others, he started playing something no one recognized. Not a standard, not a jazz song, something slower, simpler, something that sounded like it came from very far away, like a place he used to know. The other Rock Islanders fell quiet one by one, listening, letting Capone play alone. The guards in the room stopped there. Quiet conversations. The prisoners stopped whatever they were doing. I don't know what it was, Baker wrote. I don't know if it had a name, but it sounded like Brooklyn. It sounded like a Sunday evening with a family that no longer existed, in a city he'd never live in again. It sounded like grief, not dramatic grief, not the kind you make noise about, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in you for so long it becomes part of you. Capone played for perhaps 4 minutes, alone in the sound, while 30 hardened men sat perfectly still. When he stopped, there was silence. Then Tex Lucas reached over and put his hand briefly on Capone's shoulder. Capone looked at him and his eyes were wet. "That was my mother's song," he said quietly. "She used to sing it." Nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say after that night. Capone's participation in the Rock Islanders became increasingly unreliable. Some Sundays he was there, playing adequately, clearly present. Other Sundays he showed up confused, not sure why he was there, not recognizing songs he'd played 100 times. By June 1938, Warden Johnston made the compassionate decision to allow Capone to keep the banjo in his cell, but to end his formal participation in the band. He could play alone. He could play whenever the feeling took him. But the concerts, the rehearsals, the structured sessions, those required a presence of mind that Capone could no longer consistently provide. The Rock Islanders continued without him for a while, but everyone who'd been there said it wasn't the same. The thing that had made them a band, Capone's obsessive perfectionism, his standards, his insistence that the music meant something, was gone. They played for another 6 months and then quietly dissolved. Alcatraz guards who worked the cell blocks in 1938 and 1939 would later speak about what they heard at night. Coming from Capone's cell in the hours after lights out, the sound of a banjo being played softly, carefully, with increasing uncertainty. Sometimes the melody was clear, recognizable fragments of standards, pieces of Italian songs, snatches of the arrangements Capone had once known perfectly. Other times it was fragments, half-remembered passages that drifted off into silence before finding resolution. The musical equivalent of a sentence that loses its way before the end. One guard, speaking anonymously years later, described stopping outside Capone's cell one night and listening. He was playing something, trying to play something. He'd get 3 or 4 bars in and then stop like he couldn't remember what came next. And then he'd start again from the beginning, same 3 or 4 bars, then silence, over and over, for maybe 20 minutes. Did he ever get past it? The interviewer asked. The guard was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally, he never did. When they transferred Capone from Alcatraz to Terminal Island in January 1939, the banjo went with him. When they released him in November 1939 into Me's care in Florida, the banjo made that journey too. Me kept it after his death in 1947, polished it, kept it tuned, though no one played it. When asked about it once, near the end of her own long life, Me said simply, he loved that banjo more than most people knew. When he was gone, really gone, before his body caught up, the last thing he could still do was hold it. Some days he didn't know my name, didn't know where he was, but his hands knew the banjo. They remembered even when the rest of him couldn't. Some things live in the hands, in the muscle and bone, in the spaces between fingers that have learned the shape of something over decades of practice. Some things resist even the most thorough erasure. For Al Capone, public enemy number one, the empire had gone, the power had gone, the money had gone. The memories were going, one by one, like lights being extinguished in a building being abandoned. But the banjo stayed, and in the quiet of a Florida estate in the years after Alcatraz, his hands sometimes found the strings in the dark and played 3 or 4 bars of something almost remembered. Almost, but not quite. The rest was silence.